In this video, I'm going to talk about marine iguanas, the disgusting and clumsy lizard that can dive up to 65 feet and avoid saltwater toxicity by sneezing. I don't really think they're disgusting, but a famous naturalist did. If you are the first person to answer who that famous naturalist is, you'll be the pinned comment in today's video. But let's get on with their beige Becky basic biology. Marine iguanas belong to the class Reptilia and order Squamata, and they are lizards. There are about 26 families of iguanas, and the marine iguana, Amblyrhynchus cristatus, belongs to the Iguanidae family. While there are currently over 700 species of iguanas, a lot of research is going into their genetic testing, so iguanas are rapidly being reclassified, and thus that number is likely to change. But as such, there are between 7 to 11 subspecies of marine iguanas. They only get to be about 2 to 3 feet in length, and they weigh about 22 pounds on average. They have these dorsal rays along their back, and considering that most of the marine iguana species are black, they kind of look like real Godzillas, just 100 times smaller. However, some of the subspecies have some brilliant coloration. They very much so have the body form of other iguanas, but they deviate from the typical body form at the nose. Their nose is undeniably shorter and blunter than other iguanas. Their blunt nose and razor-sharp teeth evolved to support their foraging behavior. Marine iguanas' diet largely consists of red and green algae that grows on the rocks just off the beach shores. These algae do not grow very tall, so marine iguanas eat by grazing on the algae using its sharp teeth to scrape the rocks. Like all species in the Reptilia class, they are cold-blooded, meaning they do not regulate their body temperature through metabolic processes. Instead, they rely on their external environment to do so. As most of them are black in color, this allows them to increase their body temperature as black absorbs more light and the sun is their life force. So marine iguanas spend much of their day sunning themselves, congregating in colonies. These colonies can consist of 20 to 100 individuals, and they offer protection from predation and social thermoregulation. While in these colonies, individuals do not necessarily socialize with each other, so you do not see behaviors like communal grooming or playing like you would with a true social animal like apes. The only times you see some real interactions is during the breeding season, and the interactions are usually just between males and females. One study from 2008 found that the location of the colonies are closely tied to nearby food sources. So if you see a big colony on the shore, somewhere offshore in the water is a nice grazing spot. The temperature of the water dictates how long they stay in the water, because they are rapidly losing their warmth with each passing minute. They dive down to forage on the red and green algae growing on the rocks, but some have been known to eat brown algae, a type of algae that can be toxic. Now, this becomes really important to understand when I go into like the juvenile development and then their survival trends associated with the El Nino cycles. It's one of the most extreme cases I've ever heard of. Marine iguanas are endemic to the Galapagos Islands. These are a series of islands that are located over 900 kilometers or 560 miles to the west of Ecuador, and the islands are part of Ecuador. The Galapagos Islands consist of 13 main islands, 6 smaller ones, and then several islets or rock formations that may or may not be considered viable habitat. At least it's not viable for humans, and then animals maybe stay there temporarily. Marine iguanas inhabit each of the actual islands, and on these islands there are essentially 2 biomes. One of the biomes consists of the rocky beaches with porous and loose volcanic rocks, and then further inland there are rainforests. The marine iguanas inhabit the rocky coastal areas on the islands. Galapagos is famous because it is where the theory of evolution was born. And the theory of evolution was detailed by Charles Darwin. He arrived in the islands in 1835, and he documented his marine iguana observations as, quote, "The black lava rocks on the beach are frequented by these large, disgusting, clumsy lizards. They are as black as the porous rock over which they crawl and seek their prey from sea. Somebody calls them imps of darkness. So something that's not too flattering, and of course, upon his first observations, he thought that marine iguanas were probably a predator. The biggest mystery about the marine iguana's evolution is how the hell did they get to Galapagos? The most accepted hypothesis is that about 10.5 million years ago, a common ancestor floated to the Galapagos on some vegetation, likely from South America, and this tends to be the most widely accepted explanation for many of the animals that reach Galapagos and other out there in the middle of nowhere islands, especially when the animal's fossil record doesn't really line up with the timeline for when the land masses were connected. So this ancestor floated to the Galapagos and then evolved over the course of millions of years. And about 4.5 million years ago, this ancestor became the common ancestor of the 4 iguana species that inhabit the Galapagos Islands. The other 3 iguana species are fully terrestrial, so marine iguanas are special because they evolved to live a life that is partially aquatic. In fact, marine iguanas are unique in that regard because they are the only lizard species that goes in the ocean. Island ecology is unique because usually the isolation produces endemic speciation, meaning a lot of animals on islands can't be found anywhere else except said island. In theory, the marine iguanas on each of the islands could turn into their own species given the time, and of course we're talking like millions of years. But one study from 2015 identified that the speciation process has sort of already begun within the last 50,000 years. On San Cristobal Island, it was found that the 2 resident populations already behave like distinct species. They don't really interbreed and they have morphological differences, and they are already acting and looking as though they are 2 different species. But they will breed with other marine iguanas that come from other islands. And this in and of itself demonstrates the complexity of speciation, especially on islands, and especially for an animal like marine iguanas, because they are very mobile. On one hand, their mobility to move to other islands and mate introduces new genes and adaptations, which is a good thing, but it also delays the speciation process. So in other words, just because you have one species inhabiting 13 different islands doesn't necessarily mean you'll end up with 13 new species. And this 2015 study is showing that one species is looking like it is on track to speciate into 2 different species on the same island. Their mobility seems to be the stronger evolutionary pressure than the isolation, at least for now. Marine iguanas have a rudder-like tail that allows for them to propel themselves in water. They swim very similarly to alligators and crocodiles, 2 reptilians that we generally associate with having like fairly aquatic lives. While many crocodiles and alligators are adapted to swimming in fresh waters and lazy rivers, marine iguanas are different because they're swimming in the ocean, an environment that is salty with swift and overpowering currents. When a marine iguana goes on its dives, it is subjected to strong currents that can change direction all the time. As they reach the rocks with the algae, they utilize their long claws that allow them to grab onto the rocks. This prevents them from being swept away during the foraging escapades, though sometimes the currents do overpower them and the people that are documenting them underwater. While they are foraging, they are taking in a lot of salt through the algae they eat and then in incidental ingestion of the salt water. At high levels, salt can be toxic to a lot of animals, especially those with terrestrial origins. But marine iguanas have these salt glands in their navel cavity, and these glands extract the salt from their bloodstream, and the excess salt is drained into these glands. They then sneeze out this highly concentrated salty snot. And because they don't have tissues, they sneeze all over their face, and then the salt crystallizes. The crystallized salt is plastered all over their forehead, and this is a look that is often referred to as a wig. Now, I read that they may eat flies or maybe chunks of fruit a tourist tosses onto the ground, but primarily they are algae specialists. Algae is their primary food source, especially for adults. Juveniles, however, do not eat algae right away, and that is in part because they do not know how to dive when they are born. Marine iguanas do not start to go on dives for foraging for algae for at least 1 to 2 years. So what do they eat until then? It's poop. Poop is the answer. And it's their own poop, like their own species poop. While this sounds super gross, it turns out that it helps to establish their gut, so they will be able to digest algae. By eating the poop, they are primarily able to acquire the enzymes and microbes that digest the green and red algae, but some of the juveniles will also establish a gut ecosystem for brown algae, a type of algae that is toxic to marine iguanas, but the toxicity effects vary on an individual basis because some individuals can handle it better than others. This becomes pretty important when I talk about their population being tied to the El Nino, La Nina cycles, because periodically brown algae becomes the more dominant algae type, and iguanas that can tolerate the brown algae have a little bit of a better chance surviving the change in food sources. But I do want to be clear, they aren't exclusively feeding on poop. They will eat algae that is exposed during low tides. While their seafaring biology is something unique, their place in the Galapagos food web is also an interesting case. They're not a top predator. Obviously, they eat algae, but they're also not a main prey item for the predators on Galapagos. However, they have several symbiotic relationships with other animals on the islands, and so a lot of animals depend on them to kind of deliver the goods. While in the ocean, various fish, like the Pacific sargent majors, this fish tends to hover around marine iguanas and they occasionally feed on the loose skin they are shedding. Their shedding of skin is done through a process called ecdysis. The relationship the iguanas have with the fish is considered mutualistic, where both animals get some benefit from the interaction. The fish is given a meal by eating the dead skin, even though that sounds kind of gross, and the iguana gets a spa treatment, so to speak. The other symbiotic relationships occur on land. So as the marine iguanas are sunning themselves, insects are kind of hanging out with them. And some of those bugs might be a little bit of a nuisance to the marine iguana, or it might be just kind of like a neutral bug, no big deal. The ones that are considered nuisances attract birds like mockingbirds and finches, and these birds feed on them. This is another mutualistic relationship, just like the fish, because the birds get a meal and the iguana gets pest control and grooming. Lava lizards will often feed on the neutral insects, which mostly consist of flies. Oftentimes you'll see lava lizards climbing on the backs of the iguanas and catching flies mid-air. In this relationship, nothing really comes of benefit to the iguana because the flies don't really bug the iguanas in any way, shape, or form. But the lava lizard gets the benefit of a meal. So this is considered a commensal relationship where one party is indifferent to the interaction and the other one gets some kind of benefit. And of course, in this case, it's food. Pretty much at its core, we're all simple creatures. As long as we get fed, we're happy. One thing that makes Galapagos and the marine iguanas interesting, especially from a food web perspective, is, as I said, they're not a main prey item to the top predators like hammerhead sharks and Galapagos hawks, even though they are quite numerous. And in fact, marine iguanas are not really considered skittish at the presence of a lot of animals because they've never had the pressure of predation to make them scared. This is great if you're an ecotourist because you are able to get pretty close to marine iguanas because they're not going to be afraid of you. However, at least 4 of the islands of Galapagos are permanently inhabited by humans, and with them came cats and dogs. So our little fur babies are the first time they and many other animals on the Galapagos have had to worry about predation. While education and cultural shifts are taking place, there are enough strays that are doing a number on the iguanas as well as other species. Recently, their numbers have been decreasing drastically. And some of this is because of the introduction of cats and dogs, but some of this is also because of marine iguanas' population tends to ebb and flow with the El Nino, La Nina cycles, and climate change is increasing the frequency of these cycles. During El Nino events, trade winds weaken. Warm water is pushed back east towards the west coast of the Americas. The warmer water causes the Pacific jet stream to move south of the neutral position. With this shift, areas in the northern United States and Canada are drier and warmer, and then the Gulf Coast and southeast tend to be wetter than usual. The currents that normally bring the deeper, colder, and nutrient-rich waters to the shallow depths now are basically weakened, and thus phytoplankton and algae, the base of the food web, start to decline in density. During La Nina events, trade winds are even stronger than usual, pushing more warm water towards Asia. Off the west coast of the Americas, this upwelling increases, bringing cold, nutrient waters to the surface. These cold waters in the Pacific push the jet stream northward. This tends to lead to droughts in the southern United States and heavy rains and flooding in the Pacific Northwest in Canada. During a La Nina year, winter temperatures are warmer than normal in the south and cooler than normal in the north. Water off the Pacific coast are colder and contain more nutrients than usual. This environment supports more marine life and attracts more cold water species like squid and salmon, especially to places like the California coast. So during La Ninas, that's kind of when the marine iguanas have a population that really thrives, and the El Nino tends to drive their population to decline. And of course, with them being the algae specialists that they are, they're following a boom-bust cycle where their population gradually goes up during La Nina years, and then they take a hefty hit during El Nino years. Now, marine iguanas prefer to feed on the red and green algae, and when all things are normal, so during a La Nina event, the red and green algae are in abundance. During the El Nino event, red and green algae don't grow as much, and so they get gobbled up pretty quickly by other animals, including, marine iguanas. So that means marine iguanas risk it and feed on brown algae because it's basically the only other thing that's in abundance. And if you remember, some juveniles go on to have the enzyme required to stomach brown algae, but a lot of the marine iguanas don't. So many of them wind up starving or poisoning themselves to death. And their die-offs aren't insignificant either. One El Nino event in 1983 caused a 60% die-off for the marine iguanas. So as I said, El Nino is the event that causes their population to decline, and normally that happens every 3 to 7 years, but climate change is increasing its frequency. However, these events have been happening for millennia, and marine iguanas have evolved with them. When resources are limited, it isn't uncommon for an animal to change its energy requirements so they can live off of less. For example, research has found that as habitat loss continues across the planet, more and more animals are growing smaller to compensate for their habitat and thus resources disappearing. While this is an observed trend seen over time, marine iguanas are the only animal capable of shrinking their skeleton during El Nino events. When food becomes available again, they will be able to get back to their normal size. And so this is how some of the iguanas that can't process brown algae survive an El Nino event. The problem marine iguanas are facing right now is the climate change is causing the El Nino events to happen more frequently, as I said before. Every 3 to 7 years sound frequently enough to me, but they are resilient and they have been able to evolve with that level of frequency. However, the El Nino events becoming more frequent, and then the introduction of domesticated animals and new sicknesses emerging, marine iguanas are kind of struggling to keep up with all of the hits to their population. To add to that, they do not reach sexual maturity until they are about 50% way through their lifespan. So they're kind of a slow growing animal, and that just kind of adds to their ability to keep up with the excess deaths. And this is the predicament of our time. The human overshoot is impacting the natural world in ways that are complex and not so easily fixed. We will see more unique animals disappear, and for me, it's a grieving process that is pretty heavy. I'm glad people are not giving up on this species though, and not treating them like they're a lost cause. In Galapagos, you can see how everything everything is connected. Animals depend on the marine iguanas to exist, and if they disappear, some of the other animals that have a symbiotic relationship with them may follow suit, like dominoes toppling over. Groups like the Galapagos Conservation Trust are focused on boots on the ground type of work, like island restoration and ocean protection. But they're also learning more about species on the island so they can efficiently understand their conservation needs. I'll leave their information in the description box below. Usually, if my research brings me to a nonprofit group related to conserving the species I'm doing a video on, I'll leave information about them. Go ahead and check them out if you want to. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe if you want to hear more from me, and we will see you in the next one. Bye.